March 23rd carries a different kind of clarity. Not the kind that comes from searching, questioning, or revisiting the past, but the kind that arrives when the mind has already done that work and no longer needs to continue. The Sun aligns with Mercury, now moving direct, and this creates a moment where awareness and thought begin moving in the same direction. You may notice that something feels settled within you. A decision that once required time may now feel obvious. A situation that felt open-ended may now feel defined. The mental movement that was present over the past days begins to quiet, not because there is nothing left to think about, but because what needed to be understood has already been processed. This kind of clarity does not feel loud. It does not arrive with urgency or pressure. Instead, it feels like a reduction of noise. The back-and-forth thinking that once surrounded a situation may begin to disappear, leaving behind a single direction that feels more stable than the others. In Aries, this clarity becomes active. Aries does not stay in thought for long once something becomes clear. It moves toward action. But what makes today different from impulsive action is that the clarity behind it has already been formed. The movement that follows is not reaction, it is alignment. You may feel more decisive today, not because you are forcing decisions, but because you are no longer delaying them. Something inside you may feel ready to move forward, even if the full outcome is not yet visible. The need for complete certainty begins to fade, replaced by a sense that enough is already known. There can also be a stronger connection to personal direction. You may feel less influenced by external opinions or conflicting perspectives. What matters more today is whether something feels right to you. This can create a sense of independence in your thinking, where decisions feel more self-directed and less dependent on validation. At the same time, this energy requires awareness. Clarity can create momentum, and momentum can lead to action quickly. The key is not to rush, but to recognize that this clarity is the result of a process that has already unfolded. Acting from that clarity is different from reacting to a temporary feeling. You may also notice that certain questions no longer feel relevant. Things you were trying to figure out may no longer hold the same weight. This does not mean they were unimportant. It means they have served their purpose. Once understanding reaches a certain point, the mind naturally releases what it no longer needs to hold on to. The key dynamic of today is mental alignment. Your awareness, your thoughts, and your sense of direction begin to move together rather than in separate directions. This creates a feeling of internal consistency, where decisions no longer feel like conflicts, but like natural extensions of what you already understand. This is where movement becomes easier. Not because everything is certain, but because you are no longer divided within yourself. And when the mind is no longer divided, even the smallest step forward can feel clear. To understand the deeper psychology of March 23rd, we need to look at what happens when the mind stops searching and begins committing. Mercury represents thought, interpretation, and the way you process experience. It gathers information, compares perspectives, and attempts to form meaning. When Mercury was retrograde, that process turned inward. The mind questioned itself. It revisited decisions, reinterpreted conversations, and explored multiple possibilities without settling on one. Now Mercury is direct. This changes the function of the mind. Instead of looping, it begins organizing. Instead of questioning everything, it starts selecting what matters. The same information is still present, but the way it is processed becomes more structured and directional. When Mercury aligns with the Sun in this state, something important happens. The mind and awareness synchronize. The Sun represents consciousness, identity, and the central organizing force of your experience. It does not analyze, it illuminates. When Mercury moves into alignment with the Sun, thoughts are no longer scattered across different possibilities, they are brought into focus. This creates a psychological state of convergence. All the thinking, questioning, and processing that occurred earlier begins to condense into a single point of clarity. Not every detail is resolved, but the core understanding becomes stable enough that it no longer shifts. You may notice that something feels decided, not because you forced a conclusion, but because the alternatives no longer feel equally valid. The mind naturally begins letting go of options that do not align, leaving behind the direction that does. This is where commitment begins. Commitment is not always a dramatic choice. Often it is the quiet moment where the mind stops reopening the same question. It recognizes that continuing to search will not produce a different answer. In Aries, this process becomes more immediate. Aries is not interested in holding multiple perspectives once clarity appears. It moves towards action. But what makes this moment psychologically important is that the action is not impulsive in the usual sense. It is the result of integration. The identity, represented by the Sun, and the thought process, represented by Mercury, are no longer in conflict. What you think and what you feel aligned with begin to match. This reduces internal resistance, and when internal resistance reduces, confidence increases. Not because you were certain of the outcome, but because you are no longer uncertain about your direction. Another important psychological shift today is the reduction of cognitive friction. Earlier, the mind may have experienced tension between different options. Each possibility may have carried its own reasoning, making it difficult to choose. That friction often creates hesitation. Today, that friction begins to dissolve. You may notice that one direction feels lighter, not necessarily easier, but clearer. The mental effort required to choose it decreases. This is not because the choice is simple, but because the mind is no longer divided. This is where clarity becomes usable. Understanding on its own does not create change. It becomes meaningful when it leads to direction. Today represents the point where understanding transforms into something actionable. At the same time, this alignment can create a sense of mental intensity. Because clarity reduces ambiguity, it can also remove the comfort of indecision. When something becomes clear, it may also become difficult to ignore. You may recognize that a decision is now required, even if it was previously avoidable. This is where awareness is important. Clarity does not require immediate action, but it does create readiness for it. The key is to allow the clarity to stabilize, to ensure that it is grounded rather than momentary. The deeper lesson of this transit is clarity through alignment. Not by adding more information, but by allowing the mind to settle into what it already knows. Because once thought and awareness move together, direction is no longer something you search for, it becomes something you recognize. On a practical level, March 23rd may feel like a day where decisions begin to happen without resistance. You might notice that your thinking feels quieter but more effective. Instead of moving through multiple options or revisiting the same question, your mind may settle more quickly on what makes sense. The process that once required effort now feels more natural. This can show up in small, everyday ways. You may respond to messages more directly. You may complete something you had been delaying without overthinking it. You may choose a direction without needing to analyze every possible outcome first. The difference is not speed alone, but the absence of hesitation behind it. Another noticeable pattern today is decisiveness in communication. You may express yourself more clearly with fewer qualifiers or second-guessing. What you say may feel more aligned with what you actually think, rather than filtered through uncertainty. Others may also communicate in a more direct way, which can make conversations feel more efficient. This clarity can improve understanding, but it can also create bluntness if not balanced. Because Aries energy moves quickly, words may come out with less softening than usual. The intention is not necessarily harshness, but directness. Being aware of tone can help ensure that clarity does not become unnecessary friction. You may also notice a stronger connection between thought and action. A decision may not stay in your mind for long before turning into a step forward. Something you decide in the morning may already begin taking form by the afternoon. This creates a sense of momentum where ideas begin translating into movement more easily. At the same time, there is less tolerance for indecision. Situations that feel unclear or unresolved may stand out more. You may feel less willing to remain in a state of uncertainty. This does not mean forcing answers, but it does mean recognizing where clarity is already present and allowing yourself to move with it. Another pattern that may appear today is the release of unnecessary mental weight. You may notice that certain thoughts simply drop away. Questions that once felt important may no longer hold your attention. This is not avoidance. It is a natural result of the mind recognizing that those thoughts are no longer needed. This can create a sense of mental space. With fewer competing thoughts, your attention becomes more focused. You may find it easier to concentrate on what actually matters, rather than being pulled in multiple directions. There may also be a subtle increase in confidence. Not necessarily in a visible or expressive way, but internally. You may feel more certain about your perspective, more comfortable with your decisions, and less dependent on external confirmation. This confidence is quiet but stable. It does not require reinforcement because it comes from alignment rather than assumption. At the same time, it is important to remain aware of pacing. Clarity can create momentum, and momentum can sometimes move faster than circumstances allow. The key is not to slow yourself down unnecessarily, but to ensure that your actions remain connected to the clarity that created them. The most helpful approach today is trust in what feels settled. Notice where your mind no longer feels conflicted. Notice where decisions feel complete rather than open-ended, and allow your actions to follow that clarity naturally without returning to unnecessary doubt. Because when the mind is no longer divided, even simple actions can move you forward in a meaningful way. Now bring this mental alignment into your own experience, sign by sign. Today is not about discovering something new. It is about recognizing what is already clear enough to move forward with and allowing that clarity to shape your direction. If you're an Aries, this clarity feels immediate and personal. You may sense that something about your direction no longer needs debate. A decision that once felt uncertain may now feel settled in a way that doesn't require explanation. Growth for you lies in trusting that internal alignment without needing to justify it. The challenge is not finding clarity, but allowing yourself to act on it without returning to unnecessary hesitation. If you're a Taurus, this shift may happen more quietly, but it runs deep. You may recognize that something you've been holding on to mentally no longer needs to be processed. A thought may settle, and with it, a sense of emotional stability begins to return. Growth comes from allowing that internal resolution to guide your external choices, even if the change is subtle at first. If you're a Gemini, your mind may feel sharper than usual, but also more selective. Instead of entertaining multiple ideas, you may feel drawn toward one that stands out as more meaningful. Conversations may also reveal a clearer direction. Growth lies in choosing where to focus your attention rather than trying to keep every possibility open. If you're a Cancer, emotional clarity may align with practical understanding today. Something you felt uncertain about may now feel easier to define. This can bring a sense of relief, but also a sense of responsibility. Growth comes from allowing your emotional insight to translate into clear decisions rather than staying in a state of reflection. If you're a Leo, your perspective on something important may shift into certainty. What once felt like an evolving idea may now feel like a direction. Growth lies in allowing your identity to move with that clarity, rather than holding on to previous versions of yourself that no longer fit. If you're a Virgo, complexity may reduce into simplicity. A situation you analyzed from multiple angles may now reveal a straightforward path. Growth comes from trusting that simplicity instead of reintroducing doubt through overanalysis. Not everything needs to be optimized to be effective.
If you're a Libra, relationships may reach a point of clarity. You may understand where something stands without needing further discussion. This can feel stabilizing, but it may also require acceptance. Growth lies in aligning your actions with what is now clear, rather than maintaining balance through uncertainty. If you're a Scorpio, deeper understanding may become undeniable. You may recognize a truth about a situation or a person that you cannot unsee. Growth comes from using that awareness with intention, rather than allowing it to create intensity without direction. If you're a Sagittarius, your direction may begin to feel more defined. Something you are exploring may now feel like the path you want to commit to. Growth lies in choosing that direction and allowing it to develop, rather than continuing to search for alternatives. If you're a Capricorn, your priorities may become clearer. You may recognize what deserves your effort and what does not. This can help you refine your focus. Growth comes from aligning your actions with that clarity, even if it requires letting go of things that once felt necessary. If you're an Aquarius, your thinking may crystallize into a strong idea or perspective. Something that was abstract may now feel concrete. Growth lies in expressing that clarity and allowing it to influence your actions, rather than keeping it in the realm of thought. And if you're a Pisces, your sense of value or meaning may become more grounded. You may recognize what truly matters to you in a way that feels stable rather than emotional. Growth comes from making choices that reflect that clarity, even if it leads you in a new direction. As we close March 23rd, notice how clarity changes your relationship with choice. Over the past weeks, your mind may have moved through cycles of questioning, reflecting, and reconsidering. You may have explored different possibilities, tried to understand different perspectives, and allowed time to reveal what was not immediately obvious. That process had a purpose. It expanded your awareness. But today marks a different point in that process. Not where you continue searching, but where you begin recognizing that something is already clear enough to move forward with. Clarity does not always arrive as a dramatic realization. Often it feels like the absence of confusion. A question you were holding no longer feels active. A decision you were delaying no longer feels uncertain. A direction you were unsure about now feels stable enough to trust. This is how alignment begins. Not by forcing certainty, but by noticing where doubt is no longer necessary. You may have felt that shift today, a quiet sense that something has settled within you. Not every detail, not every outcome, but enough to reduce the need for constant reconsideration. And once that happens, something else begins to change: your relationship with action. When the mind is divided, action feels difficult. Every step carries hesitation because part of you is still questioning the direction. But when the mind settles, even slightly, movement becomes easier. Not because you are pushing yourself forward, but because there's less resistance holding you back. Tonight, you might reflect on something simple. What feels settled within me now? What decision no longer feels like a question? And what would it look like to move forward without reopening it again? These are not questions meant to create pressure. They are meant to bring awareness to something that may already be happening. Because clarity does not demand action, but it creates readiness for it. And when readiness meets the right moment, movement happens naturally, not as a reaction, but as a continuation of what you already understand.